All right, so excited for this episode today. But for any of those that have been listening to me for a little bit of time, you know that I don't love numbers to the extent some people do. I do appreciate numbers. I like numbers, but I know that they have a certain place. They help inform the conversation. They shouldn't be the decision maker. And so numbers don't always tell the full story. Oftentimes they don't, and you can make numbers dance and you can make numbers lie. And so that's why I always, shy away from people, sports media, whoever that solely rely on numbers, pull a random figure or fact. And it's just like, okay, that's a very certain lens. And so depending on how you look at it, you got to add context. It can really change what you're looking at. So me, again, like numbers. I like playing with numbers, but I'm not a huge fan when it comes to only looking at stats. But for today, I decided to play around with some stats, and I want to kind of share what I found. So what I decided to do was I took the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL this past season, and I did it by their QB rating. And so if you look at this first slide, that's going to be the top quarterbacks by their overall QB rating. The other thing I did was that I only took quarterbacks with 300 attempts. So there's Ryan Tannehill, I believe it was somebody else, I can't remember, who were just shy of that. But if you look at the majority, like the vast majority of this group, they all have well over 300. So 300 was the cutoff for me. So you might not see a couple guys, but everybody with 300 attempts, this is our list. You got Breeze at 1, Lamar, Kirk Cousins at 3, Russ Wilson, Pat Mahomes, Jimmy G, Derek Carr, Dak Prescott, Deshaun Watson, Aaron Rodgers. So that's the group. And so this is the group we're going to look at. And now what I did was I filtered through their numbers and I zoomed into what they did against playoff teams. And so just to see like what we could find and see who did what against the better teams. And so some of the stuff is interesting. So the first thing that I'll show you is the top 10 list reconfigured after you take the QB rating against playoff teams. And so Drew Brees is still number 1. But after that, you see a considerable amount of shifting going on. You got Kirk Cousins at 3, drops almost to last. Lamar at 2, drops out of the top 5. You got Jimmy G, goes from 6 up to 2. Pat Mahomes still in that area. Russ Wilson drops quite a bit. And so you just see a little bit of change in what's going on. And Dak, who wasn't super high, drops down to last. So, again, you take into account the playoff teams, things are a little different. Now, the one thing to point out is that Drew Brees has the least amount of games against playoff teams. He has 3. The schedule had other games, but he didn't play in those games. So he played against 3 playoff teams. And so that's something to keep in mind. Most people would think as you have more games, the numbers are going to be less, but you never know. It's still, even when you average it out, you had to have a good game at some point. So out of these 3 games, you take that with a grain of salt if you like. But that's kind of what we're looking at. And so, again, you just kind of see some interesting movement. And then there's some quarterbacks, which I'll point out later, that you see that the drop-off or the change isn't as great. So then the first question that we want to talk about is attempts per game. Who is throwing more or who's throwing the most against playoff teams? And so when you shift that over, there is a group of 7 quarterbacks that throw more against playoff teams than they do overall. And so number 1, you got Pat Mahomes. Number 2, Drew Brees. They're very, very close. A little bit of separation. But then you got Dak Prescott, Aaron Rodgers, Russ Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr. So these are guys that are throwing more times against playoff teams. And so I think conventional wisdom as a fan or a coach or anything would have you think, well, okay, so usually if a team isn't as good, that's when we're probably going to throw more or pad our stats more. And so if I'm throwing more against a playoff team, that means I'm throwing my biggest throwing games come against stiffer competition. Now, that's one way to look at it. You also could say, if you're just asking yourself critically, why are they throwing more against playoff teams? They might be down, so you're not blowing teams out like a lesser team. You're actually in a competition. And so you have to put up points. You got to put up yards. And so maybe you're passing more because you're not just, blowing somebody out then sitting the starters, or you're not just running the clock out. You're actually competing. And so this might say more about the team's defense, or it might just, you could take it one way or the other. And again, that's where our context really matters, because you go through this list. There are some good defenses, some not so good defenses. And I would tell you it's probably different for each person as far as the why. But I would say just a quick glance, maybe Dak Prescott is probably the only one where it's pretty close. Like, he threw against playoff teams as much as he threw against regular teams. But everybody else, it was a significant jump, I would say. A lot higher throwing attempts against playoff teams than they did against other teams. So that's something to think about. Now, that's throwing the ball. What about completing the ball? So which quarterbacks had a better completion percentage against playoff teams than they did against regular teams? And these are our 4. We got Deshaun Watson, and very, very closely behind is Lamar Jackson. Then you got Pat Mahomes, then Aaron Rodgers. And so this is the thing you want to ask yourself. Not ask yourself, but this is the thing I point out when looking at it. So you got Deshaun Watson, who is less than a percentage, above his regular completion. So yes, we can say he had a better completion percentage against playoff teams, but it's not very significant. So that just kind of tells you it's pretty consistent. Lamar Jackson as well. His is a little bit further away. And I would say Pat Mahomes is a little more closer between his regular percentage and his playoff team percentage. And so a lot of these are close, but again, out of 10, these are the guys that completed more passes. And so why is that? There's a number of reasons you could think about, but I do think that is kind of interesting. And so that's completion percentage. And so now we're going to talk about yards per game. And when you look at that, there's a group of 6 that are higher in their yards per game against playoff teams than they are against regular teams. And interestingly enough, is not the exact same group as the ones that had more attempts. And so you got Pat Mahomes, who up there, actually by far I would say Drew Brees, and then there's a little bit of a drop off to Dak Prescott, Jimmy G, Russ Wilson, Aaron Rodgers. So the first 3 are over 300 yards per game. The other 3 are 250, between 250 and 260. So Pat Mahomes by far way more yards against playoff teams. I would venture to say, you think about his defense, that might be one of the reasons, but that's something to consider. And he's way above his yards per game against, his overall, because his overall is 287 and against playoff teams is 344. So significant jump. Drew Brees, same thing. His overall is 270. Against playoff teams is 332. And so a significant jump. Now, Dak is a little bit of a yard more than his regulars. So again, looking at these numbers, Dak's pretty consistent. He's pretty flat there as far as those yards per game. It's barely a difference, but it's a little bit of a higher mark. And then you got guys like Russ Wilson, where it's about 2 yards difference. Aaron Rodgers is about a 1 yard difference. So not everybody has the same variance, but these are the 6 guys that threw for more yards against playoff teams than they did against regular teams. Now, again, you think about regular teams, okay, you might be able to run the ball more because their defenses might not be as good. But then you think about Jimmy G. He's got a really good defense, so it's not like he had to play from behind a lot. I mean, I don't know actually because I didn't look at it like that, but just as the context, if you're just looking at data and you interpret it, you would think he didn't have to play from behind a lot. Neither did Drew Brees, but that's what data should do. Data should bring up questions for you to go look into, not give you answers. And so that's kind of where we are with that. So now the next thing I did was I looked at how many touchdowns did players get against, how many touchdowns did a player have for the season and how many did they get against playoff teams. And I did a percentage. What percentage of your touchdowns came against playoff teams? And there were only 2 players that were above 40%. And that's Derek Carr and Kirk Cousins. And so surprising names probably for some people. But Derek Carr had over 50% of his passes touchdown passes came against playoff teams. Kirk Cousins had 42%. And so out of all the quarterbacks we look at in this top 10, there's only 2 that had, I would say, a significant percentage of their touchdowns go against playoff teams. And there's a couple players, Mahomes and Brees, that are close to 40, but these are the only 2. So now what this tells me is like, where are you getting your touchdowns? Are you beating up on lesser teams? Or are you evenly getting touchdowns against better teams and lesser teams? And so nobody has a significant, like I got 90% of my touchdowns against playoff teams. But for this group, over 50 was a really high bar. And so this is kind of what you expect. Again, and this is why I like to do these things, because a lot of people get caught into, oh, this person had this person did that, and so that just automatically means they're better, and or this proves that they're that good. And it's like, well, not necessarily. You got to look at the context of it, because how many people would say, okay, Derek Carr and Kirk Cousins for anything out of this group, but they have proven that they score against the playoff teams, and so everything comes with context. And then the lowest on that group, as far as touchdown percentage, is Lamar Jackson. Only 25% of his touchdowns came against playoff teams. And I didn't pull the number. I had the numbers, but I hit them on my chart. But if you look at it, he had a significant amount of touchdowns. He was MVP. And so a very small amount of that actually came against playoff teams. A lot of it came against teams that didn't make the playoffs. So make of that what you will. Next is the same thing with interceptions. How many interceptions did you throw? How many came against playoff teams? Now, before I go to this list, there's 2 very different ways you can look at this. And this is, again, why context matters. So if you're a coach and your player threw 10 interceptions, would you rather 9 of those interceptions came against playoff teams or 9 of those interceptions came against regular teams. Because you can say, okay, against good competition, I only threw 1 interception, coach. I was playing really well. Then it's like, well, why, if you could play well against that competition, why is 90% of your passes being intercepted by play, or not 90% of your interceptions coming against lesser competition? So some people would say, I'd rather have the interception percentage higher against playoff teams, because if I'm getting picked off, I want my quarterback being picked off by good competition. You could look at it the other way. Like I said, I'm really good against the good competition, and I don't turn the ball over in those games. And so part of this, and this is where percentages, again, numbers can play. Percentages tell you like it's a common theme. So I'm telling you a percent, and that doesn't, you don't know the total number. So somebody might have threw 25 interceptions, and we're talking about 50% went to the to the playoff teams, 50% went to the other teams. That's not the same as somebody throwing 2 interceptions and they threw 1 against a playoff team and 1 against a non-playoff team. That 50% is not equal. And so that's why you got to understand the percentages. But anyway, so looking at this list, what I did is I put the highest ones. Who threw more interceptions against playoff teams than non-playoff teams? And number 1 on that list, you got Russ Wilson, 80%, very high volume. Most of the interceptions he threw came against playoff competition. Then Derek Carr, right there again, 75%. After him, you got Dak Prescott, 72.3%. And also to keep in mind that these top 3 guys, and I know you don't see the numbers, but the top 3 guys, they are on the top end of games against playoff teams. So Dak Prescott played the most games against playoff teams with 7. Russ and Derek Carr played 6 games against playoff teams. So interesting how that plays out. And then the last 3 are all tied at 50%. Half their interceptions with the playoff teams, half went to regular teams. And all 3 of them played 5 games against playoff teams. So when you're looking at this group, once again, everybody has a different interception total. But this kind of tells you, all right, these are the guys that when they did get picked off, they got picked off by playoff teams. And also the thing you got to think about is not every playoff team has a playoff caliber defense. Not always. So, you know, you could break it down even further. And really, I could redo this whole exercise with top 10 defenses, but I feel like it's not going to be as many games. It's probably going to be like probably I played like 2 games against a top 10 defense or whatever. So there's that. But yeah, it's interesting how you could look at it and kind of figure it out. So the lowest on this end was Jimmy G. Jimmy G only threw 15% of his interceptions against playoff teams. And so the bulk of his interceptions came against teams that didn't make the playoffs. So again, which way do you lean towards that? And then the last thing we're going to look at is we already looked at the top 10 with the rating against the rating against playoff teams, but which of these quarterbacks had a QB rating that was higher against playoff teams than it was against their regular teams, or against their whole average? And so that group is 3 quarterbacks: Drew Brees, Pat Mahomes, and Jimmy G. Jimmy G is 2, and then Pat Mahomes. And so I would say Jimmy G is the only one that's significant. So Drew Brees is pretty significant. It's about 4 points higher. And so that's definitely something to take into account. That's pretty big. And again, he had the highest rating against playoff teams. But again, he had the lowest number of games. He only played 3 games. Now, Jimmy G has a 12-point increase when he's playing against playoff teams. So that's something to think about. Now, you look across at his stats, and it's very different. Like, again, much better rating against playoff teams. A little bit higher passing yards against playoff teams. But his interceptions, well, I guess he doesn't throw a lot of interceptions against playoff teams. But he also didn't throw a lot of touchdowns against playoff teams. And so it's interesting to kind of look across at these numbers. But really, Jimmy G, his attempts are very similar. His completion is very similar. So it's a lot of ways to look at it. And then Pat Mahomes is probably 2 points higher against playoff teams. But we kind of know Pat Mahomes now is pretty consistent for him. And so looking at which guys, like I said, just performed better against playoff teams than their average, these would be the three. And then the lowest on that list, or at least who had the lowest percentage against playoff teams. Well, I guess I already showed that because that was Dak Prescott. But just looking at the numbers as far as the biggest drop-off, you got a couple guys. Lamar Jackson has a pretty significant drop-off. We're talking 16 points. As far as a drop off from average rating to rating against playoff teams, then you're looking at Russ Wilson, who's almost about a 19-point drop off, and you're also looking at Kirk Cousins, who is 17-point drop off. No, he's a 21-point drop-off, sorry. So, yeah, Russ Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Lamar Jackson, big difference when they're playing against playoff teams versus when they're playing against, just their average. So, a lot to think about, a lot of different numbers, a lot of other things I could have looked at, but these are the things that I felt were important to me. And so, it's not really to make a statement, and I don't think data should always make a statement. It's really, again, just to create more questions and kind of shift the way you look at it, because it does say one thing when you're just looking at it for, the totals, but when you shift the context, it changes things a little bit. But for me, just glancing at these numbers, kind of confirming some of the things we knew, Pat Mahomes and Drew Brees are super legit quarterbacks. Lamar Jackson has very strikingly different numbers than the other quarterbacks just overall. And then looking at his playoff or his performance against playoff teams, there's some noticeable differences there. And then of course you got guys like Kirk Cousins and Prescott, who a lot of people bash. And some of these numbers show like they don't do totally great against competition. But then you got guys like Derek Carr and Deshaun Watson, who might not get as much love as they should. Now, I'm still not sold on Deshaun Watson or Lamar or Kirk Cousins or Dak Prescott. But looking at these numbers is interesting. And I always like Derek Carr. So, just interesting. So anyway, that's it for me. Go to the comment section. Let me know your thoughts on anything that I might have mentioned. Share it around, get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you for listening.